we're going to have some individual or group of individuals step forward and do what Bernie did and do it again. Do it locally, do it nationally, do it both. I don't understand the big debate. If some people want to do it inside the Democratic Party, go for it. If some people want to do it outside the Democratic Party, go for that. I mean, the issue is get out there and do it. The left is there. What it needs are the galvanization moments.
So I know I've got you for a very limited amount of time, but I have pretty much close to 1,000 questions that I need answered. So I was hoping to do them just very quickly and succinctly, if that's possible.
I will try.
All right. The first one is one that is of very deep interest to my community, and that is the formation of worker co-ops. Now, one thing I wanted to get out of the way before quickly asking you about how to form worker cooperatives in the U.S., because a lot of my listeners are American. The idea has been put forth by you a number of times that worker cooperatives get rid of the employer-employee dynamic, of which I completely agree with you, and you kind of push them as like this is going to be the new form of socialism, or this is the modern. Is this a fair take? This is kind of like
yes.
Okay.
You're right on target. Yes.
Okay. Well, then on that note, though, I have had people push back on me and say that socialism, as it's defined, also requires not only the means of production to be owned by the workers themselves, but the distribution of said means amongst the community. Like as Marx and Engels defined it, your version of socialism would be more akin to market socialism, for example. And how do you respond to that?
Yes, I think that's a bit of a kind of a category mistake, and that has a good bit to do with the theory that is behind all of this. I am a serious student, and I know this may come as a shock to folks, but I have seriously studied in my life the works of Karl Marx, and I mean all of them. And I did this partly in opposition to my education here in the United States, which was studiously organized to avoid any sustained engagement with any of Marx's serious adult work in analyzing capitalism. So I had to do it all on my own or with like-minded students. I did that too. But I take that theory seriously. And the way to answer your question is to sort of review that very quickly, and I try to be brief. One of the things Marx was eager to do was to say, my focus and my concern is not on the distribution, neither of resources nor of the products that come out of production. My focus, unlike those of my contemporaries, is on production, on what goes on between the arrival of the inputs and resources on the one hand and the outflow of finished products on the other. Because I believe the relationships of production, he called them the relations of production, are the undervalued, underexplored, and underappreciated aspects of economics. Now, this has been a problem ever since Marx. The economics that I have to teach in my university jobs and that I had to learn, and I might mention, just in case anyone is wondering, I am the product of what in this country is usually referred to as the peak of the educational hierarchy. I went to Harvard, Stanford, and Yale. It's like I'm poster boy for elite education. So if what I'm telling you is true for what I'm about to say, well, it's even more true for all the other schools that try to emulate those places. Anyway, in economics, everything you're talked about is the market. It's the buying and selling. Economics is often referred to as price theory, as if it were the appropriate focus of economic analysis to look at how goods are distributed, how resources are distributed. Well, that is one kind of economics, but it's not Marxian economics. And it's not informed by Marx's economics. If you were informed by Marxian economics, then your focus would have been, should have been, on the production, not to exclude distribution. That's part of the story for sure. But the focus, the primacy of your analytic, where you shine your flashlight to bring light into the darkness you're trying to understand, is on production. And production goes on in the enterprise, inside the office, inside the factory, inside the store. That's where the stuff gets done to produce the good or the service. And for Marx and for me, that's what I focus on. And the irony of ironies is that socialists in the 19th and 20th century, including many who were good students of Marx, didn't get that particular part of the memo. So they became very fascinated with the distribution system, which wasn't surprising because that's what everybody else in the economics field was focused on. But they should have interrogated that. Had they done so, they would have seen that the untheorized is what is, in a way, the game being played on all of us. That economics should be all about how we distribute. No, it shouldn't. It is just as important to understand how we produce. And here comes the punchline. We produce in a system, a capitalist particular system, that organizes us at the workplace into a minority, very small, 5%, never more, and a majority, everybody else. The minority is called the employer, and the majority is called the employee. And then something happens in capitalism once you've set it up this way that looks, and this should be alarming to folks, looks an awful lot like slavery and feudalism. In slavery, a tiny minority called masters make all the decisions and become wealthy. And the mass of people have to live with those decisions, are not in any way able to participate in making them, and they live a life of poverty or near poverty. Ditto in feudalism, only then it's lords and serfs.
Well, what do you say to the criticism that people levy against this? That say we had all worker cooperatives, would we still have worker cooperatives developing arms? Would we still have worker cooperatives working in companies that decidedly destroy the environment or the world?
Well, I'm a Democrat with a small d, and for me, that's part of what the working class in these worker co-ops would have to decide. That means they would decide, for example, whether they want to distribute goods and services by means of market exchange or by some other means. I imagine that they would end up with a system that distributed some things via market exchange and other things via non-market distributional systems. And the same is true about what goods and services they produce and how the interactions between worker co-op and worker co-op on the one hand, between worker co-op and residential community where worker co-op is located on the other, and between worker co-ops and the general public. Those relationships have to be worked out. They always had to be worked out. The firms that started capitalism, they had to work out those relationships, which they did in a way they wanted to reinforce their capitalist system, and a worker co-op economy would do the same, except it would decide based on what reproduces a worker co-op rather than a capitalist enterprise.
Do you think that there would eventually be a coalescence between that system and the government itself? Is the evolution of this in your ideal scenario that there is so many worker cooperatives that all the workers have the means of production that we eventually would? I also want to ask, eventually, do you see an abolishment of the state happening at that level or something to that effect?
Yes, I think it has always been my reading of the history of Marxism is that there has always been a very powerful strain within the Marxian tradition that sees a commonality, a brotherhood, a sisterhood between the Marxist critique of capitalism and the anarchist critique of the modern state. The emphases may be different, the priorities even different, but there's a commonality there, and I see it that way too. Yes, I think a worker co-op economy does not have need for a powerful state and will get rid of it. I want to remind people that the phrase that some like to mock, the notion of the withering away of the state, that was a phrase developed by Lenin in Russia during his time of leadership there to articulate that was what his notion of their strategic objective included, namely that the state becomes a secondary administrator of whatever it is that the worker co-ops can't do or don't want to do for themselves. Okay, if it takes a group activity, then we need a facilitator to enable us to communicate and to work out. But since the worker co-ops are the source of all the wealth, the source of all the tax income that would enable a state to function, there is the notion that we would have a much smaller state, a much more limited state, and above all, a state utterly dependent on those worker co-ops.
How would one achieve worker co-ops in let's say fields that have complete monopolistic control, like the tech industry? Like how do, like, I can see the formation of worker co-ops working for, say, if me and some other creators wanted to form our own little, like, you know, YouTube experiment. But how do we grow or at least even take over the industries that control everything right now?
Yeah, I think there are a number of paths that a worker co-op based economy would explore to do exactly what you're saying. One of them would be to say that the priority on democratic decision making at the workplace is so much a priority that almost anything that hampers it or conflicts with it or blocks it has to go. So, for example, there might be a size limitation on an enterprise. You can't have more than whatever the number might be, 200, 50, 600, I don't know. And it might vary by technology, by particular industry. But there would be a rule that whenever you get to a size where genuine democratic decision making becomes unwieldy, well, that's your sign that you're too big and you have to become smaller. Suppose that limits then some of the efficiency or productivity you can get. Fine. That's then the price that will be paid for the achievement of that kind of democracy that has that kind of priority. Second option, if you don't want that, if you want the largeness because of some virtue that you believe it has, and you want that yet to be consistent with your system, then you would say, okay, that might be a place where the state becomes the operator of an enterprise, subject to these constraints and this oversight from the worker co-op community, so that the benefits of a large size can be gained without damage being done to the democratic root that is the worker co-op in all of the different the places that it exists in a society. So I think these would be the alternative. There might be others, there surely will be others, that can be used to solve practically any kinds of problems that arise. And again, let me use as the example capitalism. Capitalism had a problem that its arguments about its efficiency and its goodness depended upon a competition. But the problem was the system systematically drove every competitor to try to become a monopolist, which one after another they did. And that therefore they had a system which was opposed to what it produced. And that produces the most bizarre things you can imagine. An antitrust system that doesn't work, a breaking up of monopolies followed by a recreation of them. The absurdity of that is that capitalism never resolved that question because it can't face that its own structure is what produces monopoly. Well, the worker co-op society would have to, and hopefully would, face whatever mechanisms within it are contradictory to the democratic rootedness, its determination not to divide the workplace into a minority that makes all the decisions and becomes rich and powerful, and a majority that is always the order takers in this operation.
Are you proposing then that at a certain, like, once these cooperatives become more pervasive within modern society, that their very existence would make large monopolies seem just contrarian by nature? Like, people would notice the difference and that would start to break them up? Or what would this?
Yes, absolutely. That people's notion of how you run an enterprise, how you participate, that the alarm bells would start going off if something was happening, either with the technology you were using or the sheer size of your enterprise or any other dimension. If it interfered with, if it compromised your collective democratic owner-operator organizational principle, it would have to give way. Just again, like in capitalism, all of the different things that were encountered had to be handled in a way that does not question the employer-employee relationship, because that is the foundational thing that cannot be challenged, that capitalism always reproduces. So that would be the principle that would govern how you handle whatever life throws at you in the way of developments that question or compromise or undermine that which you have given priority to.
At what level do you want to see the government become involved? Like, do you want to see them actually break up tech corporations? Do you want to see them basically give grants towards more worker cooperatives in general? Like, how do you see government's involvement in all this?
The biggest thing I would like to see is a recognition of a principle. And the principle goes like this. If the government is going to, as a part of its regular practice, provide purchasing for capitalist goods outputs, which it does, provide subsidies to capitalist outfits, which it does, to organize the curriculum in schools to facilitate the production of workers for capitalism, which it does, and I could go on. What I want is a level playing field. I want every one of those things to be done for worker co-ops as equally or as close to equal as we can get to what has been historically done throughout the history of the United States for capitalist enterprises. At the very least, I would want to begin by getting rid of those aspects of government policy, and for that matter, private policies too, that systematically block, thwart, undercut, limit worker co-ops. And there are loads of those. Most banks in the United States don't know how to function. They don't know what it means to give a loan to a collective. They want to give a loan to a board of directors, to something that functions within the capitalist legal system. Well, they have to learn how to give a loan to a worker co-op. Same thing with an insurance company. Same thing when it comes to handing out government contracts. I want the worker co-ops to have a level playing field upon which to build their demonstration of what they can do. I'm very confident that if you created in the United States, and this could be done by government action, or at the very least, by government inaction to make it impossible to do what I'm about to say. But there ought to be a sector of the American economy. In every one of the 50 states, there should be a whole collection in manufacturing and services of worker co-ops, so that the American population over a reasonable number of years could learn personally, person by person, what it's like to work in a worker co-op as opposed to a hierarchical capitalist enterprise, what it's like to shop from a worker co-op rather than a capitalist enterprise, so that we would have a population that could then be presented with a democratic vote. What kind of economy do you want? Do you want it to be 99% one kind, 1% the other, 50-50, 25-75? What? You can't have that kind of decision because there is no such sector that the American people could become familiar with, or at least it's so small at this point that the vast majority of Americans barely know that it exists. Let me give you another example. Business schools, we have thousands of them. They teach 8 million courses about how to start, run, finance, grow capitalist businesses. And you can count on the fingers of one hand the number of them that give you anything like a series of courses on how a worker co-op works, or what the difference is in the efficiencies of the two kinds, in the work experience, in the financial viability, in the duration. All of the important questions about enterprise are simply excluded from the business school curriculum, even though the little bit of information that we have about the relative efficiency of the two, done by a business school professor, by the way, indicates that the worker co-ops have nothing to fear when they're compared with capitalist enterprises in terms of efficiency, profitability, length of existence, rates of growth, and so on.
Oh, all the studies I've read actually show that they can be more efficient. Like not all the time, but by a very slight margin. But what do you say to countries that already have this? Let's use Spain for an example. Like with Mondragon, that has to be the largest umbrella worker cooperative organization. But Spain itself has not really caught on as a country towards wanting to switch over to that system, despite having the greatest example of that working before them.
Yes, I think they have the greatest example. That's correct. I might mention that the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation is also a laboratory, if you like, a very successful one. You know, it started in 1956 with 6 workers. It's now the 7th largest corporation in all of Spain. It counts over 100,000 employees as part of the thing. That's an amazing record of growth, would be the envy of any capitalist corporation. Along the way, they became what you might call a holding company, in the sense that the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation is actually a family of around 200, 250 individual co-ops. And therefore, it's a laboratory in the sense they've learned how to work together, how to support each other, how to combine their efforts. For example, they all together sustain their own bank, the Casa Laboral. They sustain their own university, where, by the way, a business school that had the slightest commitment to this could quickly adopt their courses, their curricula, their reading lists. They even have a number of Americans on their faculty teaching at the Mondragon University courses in how to start a co-op, how to finance a co-op, how to deal with the interpersonal problems inside a co-op, all of those kinds of issues. None of that is new. Well, why didn't it spread? Well, I think the most honest answer I can give is that we in the West, we are coming off of 3, maybe 4 centuries of capitalism. It takes a long time to develop in people the ways of thinking, the assumptions, particularly the unconscious or unspoken assumptions about what work is, how work should be organized, and on and on and on. And I think it takes time. There's no shortcut to all of this. If you did have a kind of violent revolution in some place and capitalism was decreed as over, and everybody was reorganized into worker co-ops, you might feel good for a few months or a few years. But what would happen is what will inevitably happen everywhere. You're going to have to go through a tremendously difficult period during which people's ways of thinking about work and life undergo a change. Let me give you two examples. I'm sure you've heard of them, but they epitomize it. If I had to answer the question, what is the question you get as you travel around the country and the world talking about this? Here's one I get a great deal. Hello, I'm a worker. I like your idea. It's very nice. But man, I don't want to go to any more meetings. At the end of the day, I want to go home, have a beer, and relax. I don't want to be involved in running the enterprise. Mm-hmm. I understand that. I mean, I feel tired at the end of the day too. I want to take it easy. I don't want to have more meetings. I get it. I really do.
I like beer.
I think it's a category mistake. No one wants you to stay extra. No one wants you to have more meetings. Your work time, your 40 hours or whatever the work week ends up being, will include, not have added to it, but will include the meetings at which you will be part of what directs the enterprise. You will be on the board of directors, as all the workers will be, one person, one vote. And you will come to demand that in the same way that your question says you demand to be able to go home at 5 o'clock. I get it. I know why you feel that way. Just like I know why the bar on your way home refers to what you can do there as the happy hour, because you're not so happy before. I get all of that, but that's going to change under a worker co-op system when people's whole attitude towards the work process will be transformed.
Yeah. I was also going to say they're also recently leaving an authoritarian government, right? So that probably takes a little bit of time. Oh, Spain. If we're still talking about Spain, right? It was shortly after Franco, and that would probably make sense as to why it hasn't completely taken hold.
In their early years, they had the Franco problem. In their early years, they were thought of, and it was traumatic for them. I mean, I know their story. They were thought of as socialists and communists, which a good number of them had in fact been. And this was anathema, not just under Franco, where you could lose your life with that, but even later under the successive governments that Spain has had. And so Mondragon, for example, plays an interesting political identity game. They are nonpartisan. If you talk to them, no, we do not support the Socialist Party of Spain or the Communists or the Greens or anybody. No. We welcome every political party. We work with them all, which, by the way, they do.
An apolitical worker cooperative. That's interesting.
Yes. They go out of their way. Now, when you get to know them, they will say the same thing, but there will be a wink and a twinkle in their eye because they want you to understand why they're saying it, which is why I'm rendering it this way to you as I speak. They are what they are, but they live in a society where they are still a relatively odd, unusual phenomenon. Now, they've been there so long that nobody messes with them. Nobody attacks them. They are very secure and they're very safe where they are, and they have been for a long time. But they are still very, very cautious. You get a little bit less caution if you go to nearby Italy and you go to the province of Emilia-Romagna around the northern city of Bologna.
That's where 1/3 are worker cooperatives, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And so they have much more of when you go there, almost the bravado, because they're such a big, I mean, they're just under half. I think it's 40%. But they've been there for a long time. Everybody in the province is used to the fact that many of the businesses that you deal with, whether you walk down a shopping street or you call up somebody to fix your refrigerator, you're going to be dealing with worker co-ops all the time. And not only that, because it's 40%, it's almost certain that someone in your family is working in a worker co-op, so that when the family has a get-together for a picnic or a birthday, Aunt Matilda and Uncle Harry will be talking about their worker. It's part of your life,
Mm-hmm.
and it changes everybody because it's a constant topic. How this is going, a story about something that happened over there is linked in the conversation to the fact that it's a worker co-op, and therefore you couldn't do what you might have been able to do in a capitalist enterprise, or vice versa. You can almost think of it as an ongoing dialogue between these two systems, because they are now coexisting rather than being mere ideas in the minds of a few people.
Are you aware of the viral meme surrounding you and socialism?
I don't know. No, I don't think
Okay,
so.
so you gave a speech, I can't remember where it was, but you said the sentence, socialism is when the government does stuff. And the more stuff it does, the more socialism it is, or something to that effect. I can't remember the exact quote, but it's taken on a life of its own. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that, because I know a lot of people, when it's shared around and it's used as a meme, that word has kind of lost a lot of meaning in the US, right? Like socialism is everything from healthcare is socialism now, right? As opposed to the actual textbook definition.
If I uttered those words, it was really critical. It was meant to mock the term in just the sense you just articulated. That it has come to mean. Well, this happens to me here in the United States all the time. The post office, I am told, is socialism, or Amtrak, because it's a government-run rail system, is socialism, or the Tennessee Valley Authority, the electric utility in that part of our country, is socialism. And I make fun of that because this is the craziness of what happened to socialism at the end of the 19th century and through much of the 20th century. There was a sizable group of socialists who read that famous the set of pamphlets, particularly Engels wrote, but Marx and Engels together, in which a strategy, a broadly defined strategy, was laid out and picked up. And the strategy went something like this. How do you get the transition from capitalism to socialism? What is the strategic way this is going to be done? And to make a long story short, the answer was take over the state. That's how you're going to do it. Why is that the strategy? Because we were able to win the principle of universal suffrage. And if everybody has the right to vote, well, the working class is way larger than the employer class. Therefore, we have a natural capacity to win in elections if we mobilize our natural constituents, namely the workers. And we were going to develop a labor party or a worker party or a socialist party, and it is going to have as its goal to take over the state. So it stops being the enforcer of capitalism and becomes instead the facilitator of the transition to socialism. And then the sad thing that happened was you won that. You got that in the Russian Revolution. You got a foretaste of it in the Paris Commune in 1870. But the first real success was 1917 in Russia. And you take over the state. But then the problem arises that we don't all agree on exactly what the transition is to go toward what. What is it? And as happened so often in history, a midpoint evolved into the end point. And so having the state do things that workers want becomes not the means for a social transition, but it becomes a transition accomplished. And literally, Stalin said that at the end of the 1920s. No, we are not, as Lenin had said, state capitalism, where the workers control the state, but we still have capitalism because we haven't made the transition. No, says Stalin, since Lenin is dead and Trotsky's out of the country, Stalin says, no, we've achieved it. And then suddenly, the powerful state erected in the first decade of the Russian Revolution becomes the definition of socialism. And so it isn't that surprising that a person attending a talk I give in Missouri wants me to explain to them why the post office is or isn't socialist. That is a sad comment on the evolution of what socialism was. But if that's a meme going around, it's me criticizing that idea that the state doing stuff is socialism. If anything, I'm the opposite of that.
Well, actually, I've got the quote here. It's when the government does stuff, that's socialism, and when the government does a lot of stuff, that's communism. That I think is the meme. Yeah.
Yeah, no, what I'm doing there is when the government, there are two kinds of socialism that grew up in the 20th century. One kind is the Scandinavian, Western European. The government comes in and regulates and controls, but it leaves the enterprises in the hands of private capitalists. So that's one kind of socialism, and the people who do that call themselves socialists. Then there's the other kind where the government does more. That is, beyond regulating and taxing and intervening, it takes over the actual running of the enterprises. In other words, the state does a big bit more intervention in the economy than it would in that first case of the European social democratic Scandinavian. So I was explaining to people, this is the kind of socialism of Western Europe. And then when the government does that more thing, run it, then you have Russia or China. But I always set that up as the basis for then saying the socialism I'm after is critical of those traditions for two reasons, which really are one. First, it overdid it on the state. And number two, it seriously underdid it on the transformation of the enterprise, the base of society. For people who are Marxists and who know what the words relations of production mean, the human relations of production, it is an astonishing reality that historians will comment on for the next centuries, that socialists could have become so fixated on the macro, on the government, on the society as a whole, that they lost sight of what socialism meant when you understood it in terms of the daily life and particularly the daily work life of the mass of the working class. What kind of a socialism doesn't transform that as part of its agenda? And the answer is that's really what happened in the 19th and the 20th century. That's not to say that there weren't good things accomplished by socialists. There were, but there were also awful things accomplished. And part of the reason for that mixed evaluation is that it was a lopsided socialism, way too focused on the macro and the state, and way too under-focused on the transformations of the workplace that could have and should have been a key component. And that's why I'm saying that in this century, the 21st century, my guess is the pendulum is going to swing the other way. In other words, we're going to be focusing on and prioritizing transforming the daily work life, and by extension, the daily home life too, of the working class. That's not because we don't care about the state, we do, or that we don't care about the macro dimensions, we do, but we're correcting a grotesque imbalance on the macro side, and that requires us to put a little extra emphasis on the micro side, which is why the focus on the worker co-op.
Hmm. I guess that would be a great transition into the greatest Marxian politician of the modern age. What are your thoughts on the upcoming American election and Joe Biden?
Well, Joe Biden is for me, um, it's a sadness. I feel as though I'm watching the corporate democratic machinery, the view of the Democratic Party that whatever sense it could have made of the New Deal, that is all ancient history. Social democracy is not viable in their view for the United States, and that corporate neoliberal uh, politics and economics is the only way for them to go, that they will be Republican light. They will do what the Republicans do, but not so quickly, not so harshly, and with a good bit of social welfare to take some of the harsh edges off. I believe that's what he is. I believe that's what Kamala Harris is also. Um, and it's a sad comment on how much further we have to go in the United States to even get to the level of a socialist party or a social democratic party of the sort that is a taken for granted everyday part of every country in Europe.
Yeah, and Canada and New Zealand as
And
well.
absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. And
I,
it's not to say that those parties don't have criticisms that they deserve. They do. But that we are still in this position, it shows me that the Cold War is still with us. The legacies of the Cold War still weigh on this country. The treatment of Bernie Sanders by the rest of the Democrats, the treatment of AOC by the Democrats, and so on. It's all of a piece of this sad, pathetic disintegration. But to answer your question more provocatively, which may interest you,
mhm.
I also think that we are living through, and this is not something I have thought before. I'm not an alarmist, particularly. I'm more optimistic than I am pessimistic. But I think the United States is in a period of basic economic decline. I think capitalism has left the United States behind. The dynamic centers of growth of capitalism are elsewhere, in China, in India, in Brazil, in places like that, for better and worse, both. But that the United States is heading down, and that is exhibiting each month more and more symptoms of that kind of long-term decline.
Do you think there's a lot more room, though, for the left to, I guess, grow within a Biden administration than within a Trump one? Seeing as that how it seems like the Trump administration is eroding whatever gains the left movement may have made in the United States over the past little while.
Well, I'm a student of Marx, but that also, because of history, makes me a student of Hegel. So it's never one way or the other. It's always both. Uh, the contradictions are everywhere. Yes, I understand what you're saying. Trump would send the Proud Boys or somebody else to bother us, all very likely for all the obvious reasons. But the Biden people have another way of going after us, and I have been victimized in my life more than a few times. I've always said, for example, as I worked my way through being a professor at several universities here in the United States, it was easier for me to come to terms and have a working relationship, excuse me, with conservatives than it was with liberals. The liberals were threatened by my radicalism and those of my colleagues who were like-minded, and were very bitter, very uncomfortable in having people to their left in a way that the conservatives didn't. So I'm very wondering whether Mr. Biden and Kamala Harris won't be as harsh in their efforts to repress a progressive formation within the Democratic Party, as in his way, Trump has been as well. I understand the risks with Trump; they're real, and all of that. But there are different, but not necessarily less dangerous risks from the Biden-Harris ticket. And the, the joke that the left has so often made that here in the United States we have two pro-capitalist parties. I mean, that's true. That's what we do. And what we don't have is a political party that offers explicitly and clearly a different way of thinking about and responding to this society's problems. And that is a terrible loss for this country.
But is that realistic in a two-party system in the United States? Because, my course of action has always been to tell people I think you need to infect the Democratic Party of the United States, because otherwise there is no viable third party candidate, at least not in our day and age, especially with like the left comprising of what is it, like maybe less than 4 or 3% of the electorate, like the actual left. What I mean, people who are, anti-capitalist, what have you.
Well, I think it's now growing and growing fast. So I'm a little more hopeful, perhaps, in that. I think my experience traveling around the United States is that the left is very large and is very deep in this country. But it is horrifically, and I chose my word, horrifically unorganized. It's worse, it's disorganized. It's even worse, it is committed to not being organized. It has a deep, often unconscious aversion to organization, a kind of rugged individualism that you hear articulated on the right, but which is at least as deeply entrenched on the left. And that,
why do you think that is?
I think it's the Cold War. I think what happened in the 1940s, 50s, and into the 60s, and I can't overstress it, so I'll use the words I want to use. It was a trauma. The way, I don't know, the sex abuse on a child is a trauma. And it takes a lot of work and a lot of psychological courage to work your way out. You can do it, but you have to do the work. And I don't think it was done. I think during the 1930s, an enormous part of the population in this country got caught up in the social democratic dream that was articulated in those days and joined the Socialist Party by the tens of thousands, and joined the Communist Party by the tens of thousands, and joined the CIO by the millions, and really had a sense, egged on by the leaders of all those organizations, that there was a new world coming, that the United States had a kind of radical promise that was now being realized, and this, it culminated in the New Deal. It culminated in the WPA and those other projects for the governments when it employed people, millions of them who would have otherwise been unemployed. It reached another kind of crescendo by making an alliance with the Soviet Union that was a clear declaration that everything fascistic, Nazis, Mussolini, Tojo in Japan, that these were the enemies of America, and that, then to have all of that built up from the early 30s through 1946 and 7, which is a long time, then to have the whole world come down on these people, fired from their jobs, deported in many cases, condemned by every single political authority, every economic authority, most of the mainline church. Everybody had nothing to say but that you were evil, you were literally un-American, as the name of the committee in the House of Representatives. I don't think the American left has ever recovered from that. I think in the DNA of the children, since the people who lived through it as adults have since died, that their children carry in them a kind of parental warning. Don't get caught up in organizations of the left. You will come to rule it. It will hurt your career. It will bring attention on you from political authorities who wish you no good at all. Don't do that. That is scary. That is danger. Even if the words aren't uttered, there's something that you shy away. And it takes a lot to bring you out of that.
What do you think can be done, though? Because I agree with you. There's a huge problem with leftist infight. I don't know if you're as terminally online as the rest of us are, but if you go on leftist Twitter, for example, it's nothing but infighting. And I think the last time the left was truly as unified as I've ever felt was under the Bernie Sanders campaign run, because for some reason, all of us, well, I know the reason, we were all galvanized towards a singular idea, right? And it didn't matter if you were a Canadian like myself, all of us were like, this is happening, right. We're codified. What can be done in the absence of something like that?
Well, I think given the United States, we're going to have some individual or group of individuals step forward and do what Bernie did and do it again. Do it locally, do it nationally, do it both. I don't understand the big debate. If some people want to do it inside the Democratic Party, go for it. If some people want to do it outside the Democratic Party, go for that. I mean, the issue is get out there and do it. The left is there. What it needs are the galvanization moments. I like to use the image from chemistry, a supersaturated solution. When you drop a microscopic amount of whatever is dissolved in that solution into it, all of it crystallizes suddenly. You go from liquid to solid. I think the left in the United States is provoked, has become much, much larger, is particularly strong among young people, which is very good, is less prone to divisions of sex and gender than it used to be. Those are all positives, but you need whatever that event is or that personality. Look, Bernie has been around a long time. Many, many years ago, I worked with. I know him, and he knows me, and our trajectories in this country have overlapped. But he did this amazing thing against the advice of many around him to do this in 2016 and again in 2020. And the arguments against were basically, it won't work. Nobody takes it seriously. I remember sitting, because if you go to the elite schools like I did, you know all these people, whether you want to or not, sitting with a leader of the Democratic Party who assured me early in 2016 that Bernie wouldn't get more than 1% to 2% of the vote anywhere, and that therefore they weren't worried. Well, I tell the story only to indicate that none of them knew, none of them understood that the left is much bigger and much deeper and much easier to rally than you would have thought. Many years ago, 1985, I lived in New Haven, Connecticut, because I taught at Yale for a while, and I got my PhD at Yale, and I lived in New Haven. And I ran for mayor of the city of New Haven, 1985. We formed the New Haven Green Party, and I ran as the mayor. And the newspaper in town throughout the election campaign kept referring to me as the Red Green. They thought that was cute. And, it is or was in a way. But I didn't hide that, yes, I taught Marxian economics. And if you asked me, did I find Marx's work interesting? I said, you betcha I did, which was a no-no then. But I ran in a city of 125,000 people, never having run for anything in the city before, and I immediately got 10% of the vote. And 2 years later, in 1987, I ran for what's called the Board of Aldermen. It's like a city council, it's a legislative body in my neighborhood, and I got 47% of the vote. I don't mean to boast because it's really not about me, but had I stayed in New Haven and continued to work, I'd be the mayor of New Haven now. And despite being a red-green, because in reality, these dismissive labels are losing their force literally every day. And I really mean that. Whether it's because the people for whom they were urgent are dying off by the sheer process of aging, or whether the climate has changed politically. All of these things are true. A new generation has arisen that doesn't know much of what happened before and could care less in most cases. If you make a reasonable pitch, if you explain why you're doing it, and you don't appear to be crazy, an awful lot of people will give you a hearing, especially because the conventional politicians have been riding on what is old and no longer vibrant for a long time. I think that's why Bowman won that race in Westchester. I think that's why AOC beat the fellow in Queens. Not to take away from the campaigns they ran, but the old party is as decrepit as this system, and we aren't. And I think we are going to be, we, the collective left in this country, whatever we do, are going to be more successful in the years ahead because we are emerging at a time when everything associated with the post-war period is dying. The economy, the political parties, the conventions, the old technology, it's all fading away. Even the position of the United States in the world is just not there anymore, and that's not going to change, and that's not going to be reversed. The ascendance of China is, this is the work I do, that's not reversible. They're making gains every day. Their performance over the last 25 years, if it weren't this country's determined insularity, it would be the number one topic of discussion, what is going on over there. It's just radically different from what is happening here, which is why the countries that are closer to China are having to confront it literally on a daily basis.
I know that you said you only had like 20 or 30 minutes to talk to me, or at least your organizer did, and we've been going for over an hour now, so I appreciate it. I'm going to have delusions of grandeur and say that it's just because this was a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, that is part of it, and look, I am grateful for your success. I think it is wonderful that you went from being literally thrown off of YouTube, if I understand the story, to being brought back with apologies, and that this enabled you to get a much larger audience. I think you are, if you allow me, a bit of a proof from my hypothesis. I think my success, why is this happening to me? I have no idea. I am very clear that whatever it is that enabled Bernie to do what he's doing is the same social transformation that is giving me my audiences, probably giving you yours, all of it. It's amazing to see. We have our website, we do a question answer thing where people send me questions. I can't answer all the questions, but the important thing is the questions are very good. People are really thinking about how we change this society, what it
Professor
is we are
Wolff is a
going
legend.
to.
Thanks for laying
Questions
down
like those
concrete
you
goals for us
asked,
to work
which
toward
are
a
the
better
right
future.
questions
Poggies.
and which need to have work done on them. We're just in the early stages, but we're collecting so many people with such, I don't know what the words are, an urgent desire to make social change. That's dynamite. We just, again, I hate to belabor this, but we have to overcome our hesitancy to work together. It's awful to watch. I'm the child of immigrants. My father was French, my mother was German. I was born in the United States, but I didn't speak English until I was dropped in kindergartens, when I was 5 years old. It has always been painful for me to juxtapose the disorganization of the United States to the networks, formal and informal, for example, of my French family living in Paris and being contacted every few weeks by the local organizer of the Socialist Party, talking to them, collecting the dues payments, and then being present when the phone call comes. Look, the prime minister has done something awful. We need a few thousand people over there at the Place de la République. Please, can you bring 2 or 3 of your family to come? And my family understanding, they don't have to do it each time. But if 2 of those requests go by without you doing it, when the 3rd one comes, you go. And why do you go? Because you're part of this network. And all the subtle ways that these kinds of networks work means that the government, well, to give you an example, governments in Europe can't do what the United States did. No government in Europe threw tens of millions of people out of work the way this one did. 60-odd million Americans have had to file for unemployment for part or all of the period since the 3rd week of March in this year. No European government can do that. Why? Because of the socialist networks and the labor union networks. If you dared to do that, those people would be in the streets and you'd have a lockdown way tighter than anything you did against COVID. And they all know it. Whether they're conservatives or not makes no difference. You can't do there. You can't add to the anxiety of your people about the COVID illness or about the viability of the economy. You can't add the burden. I don't know if I have a job. I don't know if that job will be there when this is over. I don't know under what terms I will be able to go back to the job, if I can go back at all. You can't do that to the working class there because they won't let you. And they've already demonstrated in 100 ways. You can be very sure that what I just told you about my socialist family in France is understood by every politician in France. You can't do it. Americans have to learn this because it'll teach them the concrete value of organization. I don't mind that there are worries and suspicions that organizations can overwhelm individuals, can behave badly. That's true. Let's learn from that. But we haven't learned it. We've been traumatized, and we have to undo that because we're not going to be able to get anywhere near what our numbers deserve if we don't organize.
Et tu parles français?
Très bien, à cause de mon père qui est né en France. Et je parle aussi allemand parce que ma mère est née à Berlin. Et si on a une mère allemande, il est obligatoire de parler allemand toute la vie.
Alors, la prochaine fois, nous pourrons faire une interview en français, oui?
Avec plaisir, c'est une opportunité pour moi que je cherche tout le temps. Parler allemand ou parler français, s'il y a des gens avec qui je peux bavarder.
Oh, Professor, this was an absolute pleasure.
Okay.
Of the highest order. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And look, we very much had a wonderful time with all of you on our show. Let's keep doing that back and forth and keep it going.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Richard.
All right. Thank you.
Hey, we want to mutual aid you to get some eyeballs on your work. So if you have a leftist YouTube channel or Twitch stream or something you want us to advertise, just send us a 20 to 30 second ad using the forums at weareserfs.com. We'll do our best to help you out. And please submit once per channel.
To our God, I'm Rad. We pray at your altar of greatness. To our monarch, Tom Spiker, you are the light that guides our path. To our lords, Jimothy K. Meeble Beeps Jr., Ryan Lubin, Trevor R., Jeffrey Lamb, Poppy Nelson, Stephen, Hans Josephine, Nine Tails Cosmic Fox, we bow meekly for your pleasure. To our Knights of the Round Table, J. Fraser Cartwright, Thomas Brereton, Ali Menthol, Jimmy Bignuts, Good Poon Hates Cops, That's Solid Poon Then, Violent Orchard, Sophie Baby, Political Puppy, Andreas Chiringoito, Goofus Lankius, Zach Christensen, Nicholas Marks, Yoppie, Josh Mickelson, Dr. Zayas, Dylan Byth, Todd Buckingham, and Todd Lajeunesse. We salute you.